All right, hey team. So let's talk about the birds that are the reptiles, or the reptiles that are the birds. Let's talk about them. So just to remind us where we're at, so this is all phylum Chordata here. We're in the vertebrates, talking about gnathostomes, organisms that have jaws. Now we're talking about tetrapods, those vertebrates that are adapted for life on land with limbs. And now we're going to be in the reptile clade, which reptiles, birds, and mammals are all part of the amniotes, meaning that they produce those amniotic eggs. Okay, so if you remember from what we were talking about with the reptiles, so these diaspid, this clade right here, birds are part of the archosaur group within that diaspids. Okay, and so they are most closely related to dinosaurs. So they're the ones, they are basically the last living relatives of what was the dinosaurs. So birds are reptiles, endothermic reptiles that are adapted for flight. And they've changed the structure of their front limbs. Evolution is the process. Natural selection has caused the structure of the front limbs to change, and it has become adapted for flight. Okay, so they no longer have those front limbs that are used for walking with those digits. Those limbs are now adapted for flight. And most of the traits that we're going to see in these birds are there to enable or facilitate flight in some way. Okay, some adaptation that allows them to fly or to minimize the energy expenditure of flight. So, for example, their bones are often filled with air. So they're honeycomb. They're not a solid structure like we see in the mammalian bones a lot of times. They have lots of air pockets inside of them, and that allows for to decrease the amount of weight that they have to make it easier to take flight and to remain flying. They generate the energy necessary in order to fly and to get them up and out into the air through really strong pectoral muscles. So the pectoral muscles are very well developed. That creates the contractions that allow their wings to flap. And each bird, depending on its lifestyle, is going to have various adaptations. So the adaptation for soaring in a lot of hawks or vultures or birds of prey or things like that. Different shapes to their feet, whether they're going to be swimming or if they're climbing or if they're catching prey, they're going to have different types of feet, right? Like a duck has webbed feet versus a hawk or an eagle or something that have claws. Or even on the extreme end, the continual rapid flapping that we see in hummingbirds that allows them to hover so that way they can drink nectar, right? So there's a huge wide variety of different adaptations that they have, and they're an incredibly diverse group, but most of them can fly. Not all of them, but most of the birds can fly. And flight is also helped along not only with the wings and the bones, but also with feathers. So the feathers that birds have, they're derived from the same structure that we see the scales in reptiles. So we can consider it a homologous trait as reptiles, their scales. So it's still made of keratin, just like the scales of reptiles. It also provides for waterproofing, just like the scales of reptiles do as well. But now these allow for to create an aerodynamic surface, especially contour feathers, the ones that are really stiff, and create an aerodynamic surface for flight, because you want to minimize any sort of drag in the air. And then they have specialized feathers that are meant for insulation. They're downy feathers, because again, they are endothermic, meaning that they use their own metabolism to maintain their body heat. Okay? So these downy feathers help to insulate them and to trap as much of that body heat close to their body in a little air pocket surrounding their body as possible. So here's a look at some of these bones. So if we cut open one of the bones right here, we see all of these pockets, all of this space inside. And again, that's an adaptation to help them decrease the amount of mass that they have, so that way they can be more efficient flyers. Birds have some other various adaptations. Most of their other unique various adaptations are to facilitate flight, in the sense that they're lessening their mass, they're decreasing their mass. So they typically do not have any bladders, so they don't store that extra weight of liquid inside of them. And a lot of times, in many species, females will only have one ovary, or the gonads in general are just typically very small, except for during the mating season. Most birds are also toothless, because teeth are bones. They're structures that are very heavy. So that helps to decrease the amount of mass that they have as well. And they have an incredibly efficient respiratory and circulatory system. They have a 4-chambered heart, similar to what we see in mammals, but their lungs are connected to a series of air sacs that allows them to inflate those air sacs and increase the amount of oxygen that they can exchange. And we'll cover that when we talk about respiration in the circulatory system a little bit later. In many species, because they are flying and they're typically up higher than everything else around them, they tend to have very acute vision, so that way they can be able to determine and see what's going on, so that way they can find their prey, find other members of the group, or whatever. So most birds are able to fly. There are a few that have secondarily lost that ability. For example, the ratites, ostrich, emu, kiwi would also be in this group as well. These are birds that are only going to be walking. They aren't flying. They've lost that ability to fly secondarily. And so there isn't as much selective pressure to maintain these weight lessening adaptations. So they don't have as strong pectoral muscles either. Because they're not using them for flying, they're typically walking around wherever they are. That being said, though, the penguins that have also secondarily lost their ability to fly, they do have strong pectoral muscles because they're using those muscles in their wings, their shortened wings, and altered shape of their wings for swimming. Okay. So those are the two big groups that are flightless. There's some members of birds in other groups. There's some ducks, some rails, some other pigeons that are also flightless. But typically when we talk about birds, ratites and penguins, those are the two big groups that are flightless, and they've secondarily lost some of these other traits that we talked about in birds. So again, birds are amniotes. They're going to lay eggs, and they're the ones that lay those calcium carbonate eggs. And they have to sit on them. They have to keep them warm in order to have the young hatch. Okay, so they are amniotes, but they are endothermic and they are reptiles. They are considered part of the reptile clade, and they're most closely related to dinosaurs. So that's the birds, and then we are going to jump into mammals next, and that's going to wrap up chapter 34 for us.